Whispers of the Garden. Chapter 1. The Everbloom. The scent of flowers drifted through the air, sweet and heavy, intoxicating. Seraphine took a deep breath, allowing the fragrance to fill her lungs, reminding her of every summer spent in this magical place. The Everbloom Garden was like no other, a sanctuary nestled deep in the hills, hidden from the eyes of the world. It was here that nature seemed to come alive, more vibrant, more radiant, as though each petal and leaf held a secret of its own. For years, Seraphine had avoided returning to the garden, ever since the day her mother disappeared within its labyrinth of paths and hidden corners. Her mother, the brilliant botanist who had dedicated her life to uncovering the mysteries of the Everbloom, had simply vanished. No one could explain it, no evidence was found. But Seraphine knew it was the garden itself that had swallowed her mother, leaving her with only questions and a heavy sense of loss. She ran her fingers through her thick, dark curls, pushing them back as she stared at the mass of blooms that stretched out before her. The butterflies, dozens of them in brilliant shades of orange, pink, and blue, danced through the air like living jewels. Their wings fluttered in delicate harmony, brushing past her as if they too recognized her. "I'm back," Seraphine whispered, as though the garden could hear her. The sun filtered through the trees, casting golden light onto her skin, warming her despite the chill in her heart. The garden was alive with the sounds of nature, birds chirping, leaves rustling, and the ever-present hum of life. Yet, beneath the surface, Seraphine sensed something else, something ancient and watchful. It had always been this way in the Everbloom. Taking a step forward, she followed the narrow path leading deeper into the garden. Each flower seemed to bloom brighter as she approached, opening their petals in greeting. She remembered this from when she was younger, how the garden seemed to respond to her presence, though she had never understood why. Her mother had always said, "The garden chooses its keepers." Now it was her turn to uncover the secrets that had consumed her mother's life, and perhaps even find a way to bring her back. Chapter 2. The Stranger in the Garden. It was then she saw him. At first, it was just a glimpse, a flash of dark hair and a broad figure standing among the blooms. Seraphine's heart skipped a beat, and she froze, her breath catching in her throat. The man was tall, his shoulders squared, his back to her. He stood near a large flowering tree, his hand resting against its bark, as though listening to something only he could hear. "Hello," Seraphine called softly, not wanting to startle him. The man turned slowly, and Seraphine felt a strange pull in her chest as their eyes met. His gaze was intense, a deep brown that seemed to hold the weight of the world within them. He was handsome, strikingly so, with a chiseled jaw and tousled dark hair that framed his face. But there was something else, something otherworldly in the way he held himself, as if he didn't quite belong in this time, in this place. "Who are you?" Seraphine asked, taking a cautious step forward. The man tilted his head slightly, a small smile playing on his lips, but he didn't answer right away. Instead, he studied her for a moment, his gaze sweeping over her face as though trying to place her. "I could ask you the same," he finally replied, his voice deep and smooth with a hint of amusement. Seraphine frowned. "I've been coming to this garden my whole life. My mother." "Ah," he interrupted, his smile fading. "You're her daughter." Something in the way he said it made Seraphine's skin prickle. There was an edge to his voice, a knowledge that she didn't yet possess. How did this stranger know her mother? "Who are you?" she asked again, her voice more insistent this time. "My name is Caden," he said, his eyes darkening. "And I've been here longer than you can imagine." Chapter 3. The Garden's Secret. Caden didn't elaborate on his cryptic statement, and Seraphine found herself both intrigued and wary of him. He was different from anyone she had ever met, distant and guarded, yet there was a softness in the way he spoke to her, as though he understood more about her than she did herself. Over the next few days, Seraphine found herself returning to the Everbloom more frequently, drawn not just by the garden's mysteries but by Caden's presence. He was always there, waiting for her as though he too was tied to the garden in some unexplainable way. They would walk together through the winding paths, and Caden would point out plants Seraphine had never noticed before. He had an almost encyclopedic knowledge of the garden, yet his explanations were always tinged with a certain sadness, as though each flower held a story of loss. One afternoon, as they sat beneath a canopy of wisteria, Seraphine gathered the courage to ask the question that had been gnawing at her. What happened to my mother? Caden was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the petals that floated through the air like tiny whispers. Finally, he spoke. She came too close to the heart of the garden, he said, his voice low. There are things here that should not be disturbed. Seraphine's heart tightened. What do you mean? What heart of the garden? Is that where she disappeared? Caden's expression grew pained, and he turned to her, his dark eyes filled with something she couldn't quite name. Your mother was searching for answers. She believed that the garden held the key to something greater, something ancient and powerful. And she was right. But the price for that knowledge, it's not something one can easily pay. Seraphine's mind raced. Her mother had always spoken of the garden with reverence, as though it were more than just a collection of plants and flowers. She had believed in its magic, but she had never spoken of the dangers. What kind of price? Seraphine asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Caden met her gaze, his expression grave. Her life. Chapter 4. The Curse of the Everbloom. The revelation that her mother's life had been claimed by the garden shook Seraphine to her core, but it wasn't enough to deter her. If anything, it only fueled her determination to find the truth. There must be a way to break whatever curse this garden holds, Seraphine said, pacing beneath the blooming trees. There has to be a way to bring her back. Caden's expression softened, though his eyes remained shadowed with sorrow. You don't understand, Seraphine. The garden. It's not just a place. It's alive in ways that are difficult to explain. Your mother was one of the few who understood its true nature. Then help me, Seraphine pleaded. If you know something, anything, you have to tell me. Caden hesitated, his gaze shifting to the vibrant flowers that surrounded them. I'm not just an ordinary traveler, Seraphine. I've been in this garden for centuries, trapped, cursed to remain here because of the same magic that claimed your mother. The garden's magic is tied to the fate of those who enter its heart. Seraphine's breath caught. You've been here for centuries? Caden nodded, his expression grim. Yes. Long ago, I was cursed by a sorceress who bound my soul to the garden. I cannot leave, not until the curse is broken. But breaking it would require a sacrifice, one that could destroy the garden and everything within it. Seraphine's heart pounded in her chest. And my mother? Caden's voice was soft, barely audible. She was trying to free me, but the garden wouldn't allow it. Chapter 5. The Heart of the Garden. Seraphine didn't sleep that night. Her mind was filled with thoughts of her mother, of Caden, and of the curse that bound them both to this enchanted, dangerous place. She knew what she had to do. She had to find the heart of the garden, the source of its magic, and face whatever lay there. At dawn, she returned to the garden, her resolve hardening with every step. Caden was waiting for her at the entrance, as though he had known she would come. You're going, aren't you? He asked quietly, though there was no accusation in his tone. There was only sadness and something else, something that made Seraphine's heart ache. I have to, Seraphine said. I can't leave her here. Caden's expression tightened. I won't let you do this alone. Together, they ventured deeper into the Everbloom, past the familiar paths and into the parts of the garden that few had ever seen. The air grew heavier, thicker with the scent of magic and age. Flowers glowed in strange hues, their petals shimmering with an unnatural light. The butterflies that had once followed Seraphine now seemed to guide her, their wings brushing against her skin as they led the way. At last, they reached the heart of the garden, a clearing where the flowers bloomed in every color imaginable, their beauty almost blinding. In the center of the clearing stood an ancient tree, its bark twisted and dark, its roots digging deep into the earth. This is it, Caden said, his voice filled with awe and fear. This is where the magic comes from. Seraphine approached the tree cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. As she reached out to touch its bark, a voice echoed in her mind, a voice that sounded eerily familiar. Seraphine. She froze. Mother. The voice was faint, but it was there, like a whisper carried on the wind. I'm here. But I can't stay. Tears filled Seraphine's eyes. What do I have to do? Chapter 6. The Sacrifice. The voice that belonged to her mother grew stronger as Seraphine stood before the ancient tree. It spoke of the garden's magic, of how it was woven into the very fabric of time and life. The magic was not inherently good or evil, but it required balance. The garden gave life, but it also demanded something in return. A soul to sustain its power. Her mother's soul. Seraphine's breath hitched as the truth washed over her. Her mother had become part of the garden, her essence tied to its magic. To break the curse, to free both her mother and Caden, Seraphine would have to sever the connection between the garden and the souls it held captive. But the price was steep. "I can't," Seraphine whispered, her voice shaking. "I can't lose you again." "You've already lost me, my darling," her mother's voice replied softly. "But you can save him." Seraphine turned to Caden, her heart aching as she looked into his eyes. She had only known him for a short time, but the connection between them was undeniable. He had been trapped in this garden for centuries, alone and bound by a curse that wasn't his to bear. And now, Seraphine had the power to free him. But in doing so, she would lose her mother forever. Tears streamed down her face as she made her decision. "I'll do it," she whispered. Caden stepped forward, his expression pained. "Seraphine, you don't have to do this. I've been trapped for so long I can stay. You don't have to sacrifice anything for me." Seraphine shook her head. "I can't leave you here. Not when I have the chance to set you free." Before Caden could protest further, Seraphine placed her hand on the tree's bark. The air around her crackled with energy, and the garden seemed to hold its breath. The butterflies swirled around her in a frenzy, their wings shimmering with magic as the ground beneath her feet trembled. The voice of the garden echoed in her mind, louder now, demanding its price. Seraphine closed her eyes and reached deep within herself, drawing on the love she had for her mother, for Caden, and for the garden itself. She poured that love into the tree, offering it as the sacrifice. The garden responded. Light exploded from the tree, filling the clearing with a brilliant, blinding glow. The ground shook, and the flowers around them wilted, their vibrant colors fading as the magic was drained from them. The butterflies scattered, their wings dissolving into the air like dust. And then it was over. The garden was silent, its magic spent. The ancient tree stood still, its bark now dull and lifeless. The flowers around them were no longer glowing, and the air felt heavy with loss. Seraphine collapsed to her knees, her body trembling with exhaustion. Caden was at her side in an instant, his arms wrapping around her as she sobbed into his chest. "It's over," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You did it." Seraphine nodded, though the pain in her heart was almost unbearable. She had lost her mother for good this time, but she had freed Caden. She had broken the curse. Epilogue. A new beginning. The Everbloom garden was different now. Its magic was gone, but it was not dead. Flowers still bloomed, though they no longer glowed with unnatural light. The butterflies had returned, though they no longer whispered secrets. The garden was peaceful, its power no longer demanding a price from those who entered. Seraphine stood at the entrance of the garden, her hand resting in Caden's. They had both changed in the months since the curse had been broken. The garden had let them go, but it had left its mark on them. "I miss her," Seraphine said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Caden squeezed her hand gently. "She's still with you. In every flower, in every breeze. She'll always be with you." Seraphine smiled faintly, though the ache in her heart remained. She knew he was right. The garden had taken her mother, but it had also given her something in return. Love, hope, and a future. Together, Seraphine and Caden turned away from the Everbloom and walked toward their new life, leaving the garden's mysteries behind. But every now and then, when the wind blew just right, Seraphine swore she could still hear the faint whisper of her mother's voice, carried on the breeze. "I'm proud of you, my darling." And in that moment, Seraphine knew that the garden's magic was not truly gone. It was simply waiting, biding its time, for the next keeper to discover its secrets. The end.